Benchmark, the voice of business. Presented by LMD.
On this edition of Benchmark, former senior diplomat and UN Under-Secretary General Jayantha Dhanapala outlines his wish list for Sri Lanka 2016. Business confidence nudges up slightly, rising by 5 basis points. Shaheen Carter, Managing Director of Nielsen, analyzes the latest data. And in our final segment, LMD columnist Deshal Dimel takes a closer look at Sri Lanka's macro outlook. That's the lineup for Benchmark.
Hello and welcome to Benchmark. I'm Savitri Rodrigo. As is customary, the first guest of the year on Benchmark is the former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Jayantha Dhanapala. A former senior diplomat, he is the president of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, which won the Nobel Prize in 1995. He's a former senior special advisor on foreign relations to President Maithripala Sirisena, and he will discuss a range of subjects on Benchmark today. Will also tell us what's in store for us and maybe the world too in 2016. So welcome, Mr. Dhanapala. Good to have you back on the show as always.
Thank you and a Happy New Year. I hope it's auspicious that I'm the first interviewee.
Well, it has always been so, why not? Let me ask you one thing. What is your wish list for Sri Lanka for 2016?
Well, 2015 was a watershed year in the democratic history of Sri Lanka since we attained independence in 1948. And I wish, therefore, that the people of Sri Lanka will achieve through this government what was promised on the 8th of January 2015, good governance, or Yahapalanaya, rule of law, economic prosperity for all, inclusive development, and the freedoms that we expect to enjoy under a democracy and which were encroached upon, unfortunately. Progress was made in 2015, but the big challenge now is 2016, and the consolidation of that victory will be a crucial achievement in 2016.
So, Mr. Dhanapala, in your opinion, what should be the main priorities Sri Lanka's administration should be looking at in the year ahead? You mentioned good governance. We also would like to focus on national reconciliation, if that's the case.
Absolutely. The government has set itself a number of ambitious tasks. The first and foremost task is the making of a new constitution, and that is being done within the framework of the elected parliament of Sri Lanka. It's been done democratically in consultation with all parties, and I hope consensus can be reached so that a number of outstanding problems which has bedeviled the independent history of Sri Lanka will now be sorted out. That includes the structure of government, whether we have some form of devolution for the minorities, the question of entrenching the fundamental rights of the country in a Bill of Rights, the question of freedoms like freedom of information, the question of the other independence of the judiciary, the rule of law, which is so vital. Transparency is another problem. We must, of course, ensure that past crimes, especially of corruption, are punished. We must also now ensure that the resolution adopted in the Human Rights Council, which finally, hopefully settles the problems that Sri Lanka had with the international community, are laid to rest. And the implementation of that in the interests of the human rights of the people of Sri Lanka is vital. We are not implementing those resolutions in order to please the international community, but to ensure that the fundamental rights of the people of Sri Lanka are guaranteed. So that's very vital in the coming year. Besides which, of course, there has to be economic development. And we've just begun the year with the Economic Forum, talking about the opportunities for investors in Sri Lanka. Those opportunities must be obviously competitive and be able to take away the blot that has been there in Sri Lanka with regard to ease of doing business. We have to make sure that no hint of corruption is there when it comes to huge projects. The port city issue, which was unfortunately hanging fire for more than a year, has to be more transparently conveyed to the people. Have we sorted out the problems of the Port City project? Is the land going to be bought outright, or is it going to be on a leasehold? A number of issues have got to be clarified, and this lack of transparency was not what was promised in January 8th when President Maithripala Sirisena was elected. So we have to be consistent. Nepotism is another problem where the record of the government, of course, is vastly superior to the previous government, but there are still inadequacies. And not only in the case of the president's own family, but in other cases. I know, for example, in the foreign service, a number of appointments have been made at the level of ambassador, but at other levels as well, which are sheer political appointments to favorites and to relatives, including a relative of one of the presidential advisors, who was my colleague in the presidential secretariat. And I think this is shameful, and it has to be condemned. And the President and Prime Minister should not tolerate this any longer. The Prime Minister is not very well known to be committed to having a career foreign service, even though that is the practice adopted universally, whether it is Cuba or China on one side of the political spectrum, or whether it's the United States and the EU countries on the other side. So we have to have career people running the foreign service as they do in other countries, in the same way as we have accountants running the accountancy service, architects doing what architects should do, and so on. So professionalism must be given a prime place if we are going to have economic development. We cannot otherwise expect political appointees to run the economy of the country.
In the context of good governance that was promised, and from what you've been saying for the last few minutes, Mr. Dhanapala, do you feel our citizens are getting shortchanged?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I think a lot of promising efforts have been made, and the difference between the previous regime and this regime is quite substantial still. But there are inadequacies, and it is up to civil society and a vigilant public opinion to bring this to the notice. Fortunately, we have a free media which is able, through the print media, through the electronic media, to bring these issues out into the open, unlike in the past. And there is no danger of a white man spiriting away journalists like you, for example. But at the same time, I think we need to ensure that these exposés result in a reform of the practice of the government.
Do you think bribery and corruption is less than it was maybe one or 2 years ago?
I think it's less. Certainly the magnitude from the top downwards was quite appalling, and the gossip about that was also quite evident, that there was even some degree of tolerance on the part of the public. I think that tolerance has ended. But the public would like to see some actual punishment of those who were responsible for corruption. Now, I dare say it is necessary to build a solid case against those who were responsible for corruption if you are going to ensure that it holds up in a court of law. But it's taken a long time, and there is a suspicion that there are deals being made under the surface between the people who ruled the roost in the past and the new regime. And that is very unfortunate, because that saps the confidence of the public in the government. And it also makes the boast about transparency very, very hollow.
So let's return to this discussion after the break.
Sure.
Jayantha Dhanapala returns after the break to give us his take on Sri Lanka's foreign policy on a global level. We'll also his thoughts also on world peace. So stay with us.
When we entered the industry in 1995, a new star was born as a fully owned subsidiary of People's Bank. For those seeking to grow their businesses, PLC provided the seed. We are not only Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company, but also the largest non-banking financial institution. Welcome to a new dawn for the nation. Introducing People's Leasing and Finance, PLC.
We can show you a world, shining, shimmering, splendid, amazing, beautiful, dazzling, wondrous space for you and me. A whole new world, the future's got a whole new world for you.
The most advanced technology now on multiple smart devices for total convenience. Welcome to H&B New World Banking.
Thank you for staying with Benchmark. We now return to our discussion with former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Jayantha Dhanapala. Mr. Dhanapala, we've been talking about, well, macro developments in Sri Lanka, but if we look at the rankings that we have been having, if you look at the rankings that we may have in 2016, do you think we will improve on those global rankings, ease of doing business index, for instance, freedom of speech, corruption, all those indices which ultimately do have an impact on how the FDIs and the rest of the world will look at us?
I'm not so concerned about rankings because these are, of course, academic. What is important is the situation on the ground and how our citizens themselves react to the developments under the new government and under the new dispensation. Are we, in fact, a more vibrant economy than we have been in the past, and is the development that is going on inclusive, and is it felt at all levels of society and all segments of the population? I think it's important that we should ensure that while there is certainly improved facilities for investors and for tourists, that the people themselves should not have to face a higher cost of living, and that it should be affordable. We still have pockets of poverty in the country which are unacceptable for a middle-income country like ours. And we need to therefore ensure that those who are being left behind in the development race are taken care of. We have always had a very good record as a welfare society, and our welfare programs have been the envy of the World Bank and many other international organizations. We must not lose sight of that in the development race and in the search for more and more investment.
Speaking of investment, we've adopted a West-leaning foreign policy. This current regime has done that. Is this the sensible way to go, or do we need a proper balance given the general global dynamics?
I would express a note of caution with regard to that. The history of Sri Lanka's foreign policy since independence in 1948 has shown us that a well-entrenched non-aligned policy in the genuine sense of non-alignment, plus a abiding friendship with India, has served our national interests best. On the few occasions when we departed from that trend, we've got into trouble. J.R. Jayawardena was far too pro-Western and got into trouble with the Indians, and we had to finally sign the Indo-Sri Lanka Agreement of 1987 with serious consequences. There is a danger under Mr. Rajapaksa that we went too far with our pro-China policy, getting far too much in debt with one country. Friendship with China certainly has been a staple element of our foreign policy from the very inception, from 1950, when we recognized the People's Republic of China. And I've been associated with that policy for a long time because of my own role in the Foreign Service. But I think we now must revert to the genuine non-alignment of the past. And there is a danger that while we want to, of course, solve the problems that we had on human rights issues through the very mistaken policies of President Rajapaksa, we need to now ensure that we pursue the national interests of the people. It's a very complex international situation today. We cannot be either pro-Western or pro-China or pro-Russian. We have to remain genuinely non-aligned, assessing every global situation as it comes. I recall that Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, when he was last Prime Minister, made some very injudicious statements with regard to the invasion of Iraq by the United States. I hope he doesn't make similarly injudicious statements with regard to what the United States is doing in Syria and in other places. And certainly we face a very complex situation because there are proxy wars going on in the Middle East. And I think the key issue in the Middle East is the Palestinian issue and the way in which the terrorism, state terrorism of Israel and the state terrorism of Saudi Arabia and of Qatar to some extent has caused proxy wars in this area. And the Sunni Shia schism in the Arab world is being exacerbated.
Speaking of world peace, somehow the last year and even before that, things seem to have been getting worse rather than better. Do you foresee any progress being made in the interests of world peace? We're looking at ISIS, like you mentioned, Palestine and Israel, then we have Syria and Iraq. Somehow the issue of the migrants. All these seem to have just exacerbated everything.
You're quite right. I think the leadership of the great powers has been sorely lacking. The United States is no longer capable of providing the leadership in the unipolar world that we existed after the end of the Cold War. There is a danger of a revival of the Cold War, especially after the Ukraine crisis, and the Russians are in a rather truculent mood at the moment. The relations with China, of course, with China's economic problems also have not improved. And we don't see any ability of the global powers to come together in order to maintain world peace. And in that situation, there is a revival of terrorism, not just ISIS, but Boko Haram in Nigeria and other anarchist movements are able to make headway. And that must end. There is also, at the beginning of this year, the nuclear weapon test of the DPRK, which is very disturbing because there again the global norms are being openly flouted with no possibility of any punishment or any change of the behavior of these countries like DPRK. I think what is important is that the UN must reassert itself and the global powers must enable and empower the UN to reassert itself. We are likely to see in the last term of Ban Ki-moon very little effort to reassert the influence of the UN, and until a new person is elected as the Secretary General of the UN, and indeed until a new president is elected in the United States, I do not see any improvement of the situation. But I think we must all, small countries like Sri Lanka, with some degree of influence, appeal to the global powers to once again ensure that global norms are restored, because it is in our interest that the rule of international law should prevail. Just as much as the rule of law should prevail in our internal domestic situations, we need to have the rule of international law.
Just pulling something out from what we were just talking about, Mr. Dhanapala, has the UN voluntarily lost its teeth?
I think the UN is only allowed to act when the great powers want it to act. And this is the tragedy, that the way in which the UN is structured and the way in which the charter is drawn up, very little independence is given to the UN because of the way in which the Security Council is constructed. And so with 5 vetoes, it's very important for all of the 5 powers to work together, and there is no possibility of the UN Security Council being reformed, even though that has been talked about for a very long time. I think when you talk about the Secretary General, the great powers want that man or woman to be more secretary than general, and that has been the perennial problem for a Secretary General. When Kofi Annan, who I worked under, did try to assert his independence, he was cut down to size very quickly. And he was completely in disagreement with the Western countries when they decided to invade Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and he had to pay a heavy price for that. So I think we have to live with the realities. My hope, of course, is for a more independent the United Nations, which is probably why I never made it as Secretary General. But it is important that we need to have the rest of the world assert itself so that the great powers realize that we need a more democratic world and a world which satisfies the aspirations of all the nations of the world and not only the great powers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dhanapala.
Thank you.
So we've been looking at the crystal ball for 2016 with the former UN Under Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Jayantha Dhanapala. On the other side, we have Anushan Selvaraja with more analysis for the new year. Stay with us.
Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company is now the nation's largest and highest rated finance company with 2 international ratings. Let us move the nation as one with People's Leasing and Finance PLC. Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company is now the nation's largest and highest rated finance company with 2 international ratings. Let us move the nation as one with People's Leasing and Finance PLC.
We can show you a world, shining, shimmering, splendid, amazing, beautiful, dazzling, wondrous space for you and me. A whole new world, the future's got a whole new world for you.
The most advanced technology now on multiple smart devices for total convenience. Welcome to H&B New World Banking.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Anushan Selvaraja. We're now going to take a close look at the latest on the Business Confidence Index with the Managing Director of Nielsen, Shaheen Kader. Welcome back to the show, Shaheen. To begin with, a happy new year to you.
Same to you, Anushan.
Right. Shaheen, the BCI is up by 5 basis points, which is still below the average for 2015. Now, what are the sensitivities behind this latest uptick in the index?
Well, actually, Anushan, post the budget, it's a December survey, actually the BCI has rebounded somewhat, slightly. But actually, if you take an overall perspective, over the last 12-15 months, it has been a fairly upward trend. So the underlying trend has been slightly positive. But, what is interesting is that, the depreciation of the Sri Lankan rupee, there was substantial devaluation, which has not dampened the BCI recently. And, I think businesses have accepted devaluation as a necessity for economic growth. And and therefore to correct our ballooning balance of payments. So I think that's a good sign. There's some maturity in the business sector.
According to the poll results, the situation in terms of the economy seems to have improved as well. So what does the business sector have to say about this?
Yeah, I think the business sector is more optimistic about the economy now than before the budget. And I think it appears that, the business sector is taking a medium-term view. And therefore, betting on economic growth really as the driver of business growth.
Where do respondents stand in terms of business and investment prospects?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, while business performance has improved slightly and there's also, respondents feel their future business prospects are also going to increase marginally. In terms of investment, it's more of a wait-and-see approach that is being taken. So I believe that businesses are seeking more clarity on the government's plan to grow the economy, particularly the megapolis plan. And I think after all this is clear, only there will be some commitment on significant investment.
Thank you very much for joining us, Shaheen.
You're welcome, Anshan. Thank you.
That was the Managing Director of Nielsen, Shaheen Kader. After a short commercial break, we'll be back with the latest on the economy. Stay tuned.
When we entered the industry in 1995, a new star was born as a fully owned subsidiary of People's Bank. For those seeking to grow their businesses, PLC provided the seed. We are not only Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company, but also the largest non-banking financial institution. Welcome to a new dawn for the nation. Introducing People's Leasing and Finance, PLC.
We can show you a world, shining, shimmering, splendid, amazing, beautiful, dazzling, wondrous space for you and me. A whole new world, the future's got a whole new world for you.
The most advanced technology now on multiple smart devices for total convenience. Welcome to H&B New World Banking.
Welcome back. I'm Anushan Selvaraja. Now for a closer look at our economy, and joining me is LMD columnist and economist Deshal Timel. Welcome, Deshal, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you first and all our viewers as well.
The country witnessed a boom of sorts in 2015, which was mainly consumption driven. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Now, will this boom continue on in 2016?
Yeah, I think if you look back at 2015, the boom was really consumption driven. There was a lot of imported consumption, particularly motor vehicles, white goods, electronics and so on. And that was really driven by this large amount of credit that we had available in the economy, very low interest rates and banks willing to lend at to support this kind of credit growth as well. We saw that taking over the role that we saw from construction and domestic transportation and other related sectors in previous years. So that was a kind of change in dynamic that we saw in 2015. It will remain to be seen whether those same conditions will be experienced in 2016 as well, though, to see if that continues.
Credit to the private sector is at an all-time high now. In this scenario, what would be the future direction for interest rates?
So that growth in the credit is really what supported that consumption growth in 2015. And now what we are seeing is that slowly that excess liquidity in the market has dissipated to a great extent, and therefore interest rates have started edging up in latter 2015 already. I'd expect that trend to continue into 2016 as well. Interest rates continue to go up further as going forward, and that will really squeeze out that growth in credit that we saw in 2015. It'll take some time to slowly ease off, but I don't see that very high level of credit growth into 2016 as well. And with that, we'll see a decline in consumption and the related support to GDP growth also. In 2016 will probably fall off to an extent as well. So growth will have to be replaced by other sources. I would think the logical way for growth to be replaced would be through investment, particularly through private sector investment, both from the domestic sector. There would be opportunities in areas like public-private partnerships, particularly in the housing sector, and also in terms of foreign direct investment. I think there are some areas where, for instance, some projects that were stalled in previous years, chances for them to get back on track. So I think those are the areas where growth would need to kick off in order to compensate for the reduced growth in consumption that I'd expect to see in 2016.
Inflation, Desha, what are we likely to see this year?
So inflation in 2015 hit all-time lows. We had negative inflation for 3 months in succession, but even during that time we saw co-inflation, which basically removes the volatile elements of fuel and agriculture and food-related items. Co-inflation was increasing. That indicates that there was a underlying demand pull inflation in the economy. And I think that will continue. That momentum will probably continue into 2016, and along with the base effects of low inflation in 2015, we'll actually see inflation going up above the levels that we've experienced in 2015. So from the minus levels to 2-3% that we saw in 2015, I'd expect it to go back up to around 5-6% in 2016. Again, the the caveat there is the extent to which global oil prices are going to move. Now, last in 2015, they averaged about $45-50. Already they've come down well below that. In early parts of this year, it's come down to just around $30 in some weeks. So, whether that is going to go dip further down towards the $20 mark, as some are predicting, or it's going to rebound back up to the $40-50 mark, that will again play an important role in the impact on Sri Lankan inflation. But I think by and large, we'd expect inflation in Sri Lanka to be average around 5% to 6% in 2016.
Thank you very much for joining us, Deshal.
Thank you.
That was LMD columnist and economist Deshal Dimel. Thank you for watching Benchmark, and we hope to see you again next time.